In 1712, a strange noise began to emanate from the mineshafts of Britain. The culprit was a new machine that was to change the world forever, yet it was being used in the fairly mundane task of pumping water out of tunnels. It was the steam engine, and what made the steam engine so special was that it could do what no other machine or tool had commercially been able to do before: convert energy. A plough is a useful implement to help cultivate soil, but only works when pulled by a human or beast. A windmill can grind grain into flour without the need for muscles, but the movement of the wind is simply passed on to the movement of the gears. But by boiling water, the resulting steam could push a piston and so move anything connected to it. The steam engine allowed for the mechanization of industry, where manual labor could be replaced by automation, and so increase production. It was the forerunner of the Industrial Revolution, the most influential revolution of all human history, and it began in Britain. Britain at the turn of the 18th century was an insignificant country on an insignificant continent. Empires in the Middle East, India and China were richer and more powerful, and had just as inquisitive and intelligent minds living in them. Why the movement towards industrialisation happened in Britain and not Persia or Mali, or anywhere else for that matter, largely comes down to one factor: the abundant and easily accessible supply of coal. Britain had long been running out of forests to use for firewood, and coal was an ideal replacement. Once lit, coal burns for a long time, much longer than wood, and at first, workers did not need to dig very far to get it. But over time, the mine shafts got deeper and pumps were needed to clear out the water that would otherwise flood them. The advantages of coal-powered steam engines were soon put to use in the textile industry. There, the machines producing cloth had already become so big that they had to be housed in their own buildings, factories, and powered by water wheel. But rivers could freeze over in winter or run dry in summer, and factory owners wanted a more reliable source of power. English businessman Matthew Boulton and Scottish inventor James Watt developed a new, more efficient engine that could turn vertical motion into a circular one. Now factories no longer had to be built next to fast-flowing rivers. They could be set up anywhere. Coal also sped up the production of extracting iron from rock. By first removing sulfur from coal, high-quality iron could be produced on a large scale, a feat demonstrated by the construction of the first ever bridge made of iron in 1781 over the River Severn. The increasing uses of coal accelerated improvements in transportation, and as transportation improved, so coal was able to be moved on an increasingly larger scale. For example, in 1761, the Duke of Bridgewater was looking for a way to get coal from his mines in Wolseley to Manchester, where they had a huge demand for it. Manchester was only 14 kilometres away, but the roads there were of poor quality. He employed an engineer, James Brindley, to cut him Britain's earliest industrial canal, which included the first aqueduct of its kind, carrying the water over the River Irwell. The project had forced Bridgewater to borrow huge sums of money, but it paid off. British investors were finally recognising the potential for huge profits with the right investment, something their medieval predecessors had not appreciated. This was the birth of industrial capitalism, as extolled by economist Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. Improvement in transport encouraged other industries to grow. In pottery, inventor Josiah Wedgwood, who had capitalised on the demand for drinking tea by making porcelain crockery, found in canals a far smoother method of transportation to deliver his delicate cargo. Canals were built everywhere. By the early 19th century, there were more than 6,000 kilometres of them. This canal mania only ended when another use for the steam engine, the locomotive railway, was created in 1804. Science, technology, engineering and mathematics, not religious teachings like in previous centuries, was the guidebook for entrepreneurs. Experimentation helped discover better crop rotation methods, which massively increased food production. In the 1740s, two Scottish clergymen were able to use probability calculations to determine how much their members would need to contribute to a fund so that their families could have a pension. They founded the insurer Scottish Widows. What's significant here is that in order to achieve their goal, they did not rely on the teachings of the Bible or divine intervention, but on science and maths, on making observations, gathering data, and testing predictions. Scientific observation allowed for some of the first significant medical advances in centuries, with James Linn's discovery that citrus fruits prevented scurvy, and that aided James Cook on his voyage of discovery to Australia in 1770. In 1796, Edward Jenner was able to create the first ever vaccination against smallpox. Newspapers began circulation at this time. This was also the era of the country house, designed by architects such as Vanber and Hawksmoor, with furniture by Chippendale. There were many artists and writers from this period who are still celebrated today: Constable and Turner, Robert Burns and William Wordsworth. The first modern novel, Robinson Crusoe, by Daniel Defoe was published in 1719, and Samuel Johnson produced the first English dictionary in 1755. So with all these technological and cultural advances, did standards of living improve for the people of Britain? Did the Industrial Revolution usher in a utopia of luxury and comfort? No, not at all. There were some who achieved truly phenomenal wealth, and it allowed some social mobility within the middle class, but at most this affected a third of the population. For the remaining two-thirds, life continued to be one of drudgery and hardship that only tended to get worse as time continued. The advent of the factory in particular changed people's entire way of living. As machines were able to operate 24 hours a day, people were employed to work in shifts. When before, people had been able to choose the times they worked, now there were strict codes of discipline and appalling working conditions to contend with. Unregulated factory conditions led to child labourers, some as young as 5, working alongside their families or kept as orphaned apprentices. Despite these horrible conditions, the factory provided regular work. They became people magnets. Where factories were founded, people came in their droves. Tiny villages grew into large towns, and small towns became huge overcrowded cities. By 1800, the population of Britain was around 11 million, up from 7 million a century before. When ordinary people had any time off, they tended to go to their local pub. A craze for cheap gin meant alcoholism was on the rise. This was famously parodied in William Hogarth's Gin Lane. The same year that picture was published, the government intervened by putting a tax on gin, making it more expensive and so cutting alcohol-related deaths. 2 years earlier, the first police force of sorts, the Bow Street Runners, was established. If the lives of many Britons were being made miserable by unchecked market forces, it was nothing compared to the plight of many Africans at the hands of British traders. Slavery was a very old idea, but from the 1500s onwards it had become a hugely profitable business. An estimated 3 million Africans were sold into slavery between the early 1600s and 1807. Many of the fine buildings in Liverpool and Bristol today were built on the profits of slavery. It took the combined efforts of the decline in profitability, the anti-slavery campaign, and the actions of slaves themselves to eventually persuade the government to outlaw the slave trade in 1807. The taxing of gin, creation of police forces, and abolition of the slave trade were all examples of the recognition that government was needed to intervene in society to counter the dangers of unregulated capitalism. Because George I and George II spent so much of their time in their native Hanover, and George III had bouts of insanity, government further developed without royal interference. Robert Walpole was the first Prime Minister from 1721 to 1741, and the later leadership of William Pitt the Elder in the 7 Years' War, his son William Pitt the Younger, a great reformer, and Lord Liverpool, who oversaw Britain's victory in the Napoleonic Wars, illustrated the fact that the role of the monarch was diminishing. George II was the last king to lead his troops into battle. He was also monarch when the last battle to be fought on British soil occurred, the Battle of Culloden in 1746, though he wasn't present. The forces of the Stuart claimant to the throne, Bonnie Prince Charlie, were annihilated. The battle led to the suppression of the Highland clans, many of whom chose to emigrate to North America. Still, most of the population of Scotland lived in the lowlands, and experienced similar industrial and population growth to the rest of Britain, particularly in Glasgow. Industrial growth in Wales focused mainly in the south around the coal fields there. Britain's closest neighbour Ireland continued to experience hardship mainly due to British interference. In 1798, a French-backed Irish rebellion convinced the British government to directly control Ireland with an Act of Union that came into effect in 1801. Britain's interests overseas were dictated by trade and the desire to win colonies. Britain, through the East India Company, won control of Bengal following Robert Clive's victory there at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. The 7 Years' War saw Britain gain several colonies from France. The French king got his revenge by financially backing the 13 American colonies who won their war for independence in 1783. However, his victory was short-lived as the cost bankrupted his kingdom and the guillotine chopped off his head. Britain's involvement in European wars were mainly fought to preserve the balance of power, and the usual strategy was subsidising allies rather than committing British troops. That balance of power was severely jeopardised by the tactical brilliance of a new French leader, Napoleon Bonaparte. He gathered 130,000 troops along the French coast intending to invade Britain. However, the victory at Trafalgar in 1805 removed that threat, and defeat at Waterloo 10 years later saw Napoleon removed from power. This period begins with the accession of King George in 1714. His frequent visits to his native Germany allowed the growth of cabinet government, Robert Walpole becoming the first Prime Minister in 1721. Britain was involved in numerous wars during this period, but the most significant was the 7 Years' War, which saw victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. 11 years earlier, in 1746, the last battle on British soil took place at Culloden. Numerous industrial advances began in the second half of the 18th century. The Bridgewater Canal, Arkwright's first factory, and the Iron Bridge. Britain was united with Ireland in 1801 and was triumphant at the battles of Trafalgar and Waterloo over Napoleon, assuring its dominance over the seas of the world in the century to come.